Good mythical afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Ayala with another video lesson for you. This is 5.2, Road to Lexington and Concord. As always, please make sure that you are writing your notes and that you are listening to the information as it's presented, because I have a tendency to add a little bit more than what's on my slides. So please turn down whatever's in the background that may distract you. Sit back, get a sheet of paper and a pen or a pencil, and let's get to it. So first things first, let's look at some of our objectives. You'll be able to describe how the British dealt with the resistance of British policy in our North American colonies. You'll be able to describe the effects and response of the British policies on the American colonists. You'll be able to describe the efforts of the First and Second Continental Congress, and you'll be able to describe the course of the American Revolutionary War, and able to explain why the American colonists began to call for independence. So we left off at the Boston Tea Party, which enraged the British, and they decided to act. The American colonists threw millions of dollars of private property into Boston Harbor to protest tax policy. So in 1774, the British Parliament enacts the Intolerable Acts, and there are a set of laws directly set to punish the colonists. They cannot be tolerated. So first thing, the port of Boston would be closed until the tea's paid for, which is going to be kind of difficult when trading is how Boston makes money, and you won't let us trade? They tried banning the committees of correspondence. Colonists now have to house soldiers wherever they are located. Doesn't matter if you were in one of the populated areas or non-populated areas. So the idea of the Quartering Act was reinstated and enlarged. And colonists now could be arrested and then shipped to Britain to stand trial, even if their family members have lived in the colonies for hundreds of years. So in response to the Intolerable Acts, the First Continental Congress will meet in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in September of 1774. All colonies except Georgia sent delegates. Georgia did not send a delegate because they were too far south and could not make the meeting in time due to travel time. So first thing they did is they voted to ban or boycott all trade with Britain. They began to train troops, but not quite ready to declare independence. Kind of going, if you push us, we will push back. So, the British American colonists thought this boycott and the show of force of training troops would make the British back off a little bit. But it did not, it failed. So what ends up happening is spy networks begin to grow on both sides to understand what the heck is actually going on. Meanwhile, in Boston, Paul Revere, who was part of the Sons of Liberty, and William Dawes, both part of spy networks, were there to see if the British would ever move out of Boston. So they found out that the British were moving to Lexington and Concord to try to capture the heads of the Sons of Liberty and some ammunition and cannons that the colonists were hiding just in case. So these two riders, with the help of others, will go through the countryside yelling, "The Redcoats are coming! The Redcoats are coming!" Because you can't call them British because everyone's British, and that would be entirely confusing. So Lexington and Concord. Lexington was the first battle of the American Revolutionary War, and this was where we get the idea of the shots heard round the world. That the Minutemen of the British American colonists versus the British regulars in redcoats. They lined up against each other on a grassy field, and a random shot rang out, and the fighting began. At Lexington, the British would win. But at Concord, as the British were coming in and trying to take all the ammunition and weaponry, all these militiamen and all these Minutemen from the different American patriots living in the area came out and chased all of these British all the way back to Boston town. So the Americans had to choose sides. They either had to become a loyalist, or those who supported the British, patriots, those who supported the rebellions, or they were neutral, like the majority of the Quakers would be, and did not want to take a side. So, as the militiamen were chasing the British back to Boston town, they began to surround the area, and the British retreat into the interior of the city. Meanwhile, the Americans are attacking Fort Ticonderoga. which was led by Ethan Allen and his backwoodsmen known as the Green Mountain Boys. And because Ticonderoga was more or less empty of British soldiers, they ended up taking these artillery and dragging them over frozen rivers, over mountains, through forests, towards Boston. Sorry about that long pause. So meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress will meet in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They will form the Continental Army, headed by George Washington. They will begin to print paper money, also known as a fiat currency. And they will begin to create a Congress that works like a government, as a unified government, I should say, for the British colonists. So from there, we get to the Battle of Bunker Hill. So these militiamen are sitting on the hills over Boston. And General Howe, who's the British commander, wants these people removed. So he orders an attack. The problem is the American or Continental Army, or militiamen, did not have much ammunition. So they had to reserve it. So as the British were coming out, Colonel Prescott says one of the most famous quotes, "Don't shoot until you see the white of their eyes." And what ends up happening is that though the American militiamen will lose this battle and the British will win, it shows the militia can and will stand up to the professional British army, that they have the ability to stand up against a professional army, when the British perspective of us was that these American colonists, as soon as they saw Redcoat, would run in terror. But they're underestimating us to their own detriment. So in July of 1775, Congress sends the Olive Branch Petition to London, which was an olive branch is this symbol to say let's have peace. But instead the king refuses, and instead begins to block all of our ports and sends over the Hessians, which are German mercenaries, to America to fight on his behalf. In response, General Washington prepares to invade Canada, which will fail spectacularly, and Benedict Arnold will lead that attack on Quebec, which will also fail. Meanwhile, Ethan Allen has finally arrived at Boston Heights, also known as Dorchester Heights, and he drags these cannons from Ticonderoga and puts them on top. And the British are forced to retreat from Boston because of these cannons. So the British were kind of terrified because all of a sudden the Americans have the high ground with artillery. What they didn't know is that we had no ammunition. So when they went to sleep the next morning, they have all of these cannons pointing at them, and they had to make a decision to try to remove these cannons, which if the Americans had ammunition, it would blow everyone up, or to retreat and save his men for later, which is what he will do. Meanwhile, an immigrant known as Thomas Paine is going to write Common Sense, where he's going to begin to put out reasons why the British American colonists should begin to declare independence. He states that all monarchies were corrupt. Why should a small island control a continent? Why should the king and British Parliament have the right to govern people when they have no idea how we live? Why should the British Parliament have the right to govern us when we have no elected representative in Parliament? And it's so important because it begins to help convince Americans to call for independence. And what happens is that even though, Thomas Paine writes Common Sense, Americans in general are still undecided if they should actually declare independence. They were like, we're British. We've been British for, 200 plus years. Well, about 150. And they decide to call for a resolution by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. And he wants the colonists to become independent because he's finally persuaded that the British will not understand unless we go to drastic measures. So a committee was created to draft the Declaration of Independence, headed by Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, who will write this. And he will use John Locke's ideas of the social contract and other Enlightenment ideals to say why we should become independent. And on July 4th of 1776, Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence, and we declare independence from the British Crown. So to double down on the Declaration of Independence before we read it in class, It was based on the ideas of John Locke, that Jefferson states that once a government disregards human rights, then the people have the right to abolish it, that it is our responsibility to remove any government that refuses to protect our rights. And this will be the end of 5.2. And as always, don't forget to be awesome.